All right, good afternoon. It is 1:04 p.m. and this is the date and time scheduled for the regulation workshop regarding the proposed amendment for Regulation 22.080. We do have a possible action regarding this amendment. Mr. Ferrado, has this workshop been properly noticed in accordance with the open meeting law?
Yes, it has.
Wonderful. And at this time, I know that we received some written correspondence that is also posted on our website from the law firm of Greenberg Trareg with regard to their client Las Vegas dissemination service. Mr. Ferrario, I wanted to be able to give you the opportunity to speak to these comments on your own, actually during the section of our agenda that addresses proposed changes.
Thank you.
Okay. And you're okay with that? If not, Mr. Ferrado would have to read in your entire letter, but I'm assuming you would want to present that on your own.
Well, I can't, Chairwoman Morgan. I don't want to take up any more time than necessary. That's why we took the time to put it out there in writing. It can be part of the record. I'll just hit the highlights, but I won't read the entire text of the record. I don't think that would be necessary unless you want me to.
No, Mr. Ferrari, let's do this then. This is the public comment section, so we'll see if there's any other public comment, and I will allow you to speak to your letter and whatever detail you choose at the time of our proposed changes section of our agenda.
But the letter will be part of the record, correct?
Of course.
Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Ferrari, were there any other letters that were received for public comment?
No, Madam Chair, there were no other public comments.
Okay, thank you. And for the participants today, this is the first workshop that we have done via Zoom, so I'm going to ask for your patience. Normally for board meetings, we know who the applicant is, we know who their counsel is, and we're able to kind of promote them up to be at a point where they can present via video or audio because we have several people who wanted to participate today, which is wonderful. We're going to go in the order that we gave those names to IT, so we know that we can kind of promote you up. Of course, I certainly don't want to silence anyone, but just for the sake of being able to do this virtually, we're just going to have one speaker at a time. And if someone wants to comment again or offer any additional comments, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom option, chat, or contact my assistant as well, who I know you all have her contact information because she contacted you about this workshop today. So with that, since we're done with public comment, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda. Our workshop agenda, and I would like to just give a little bit of background. Obviously, a lot of the people that were involved today in the workshop today regarding the proposed amendment to Regulation 22.080 were privy to the conversation that occurred at the August Commission meeting. And so we wanted to make sure we had a workshop, as I informed the chair of the commission and the commissioners that I would do as well, to be able to give people additional time if they wanted to issue any additional comments or offer any recommendations or history to give the commission additional information as to whether to make any additional changes to the regulation. So in an effort to not rehash everything that was discussed at the commission, I asked, obviously, Senior Deputy Attorney General Michaela to return to participate in today's workshop and give him an opportunity to kind of give an overview of where we are right now with regard to Regulation 22.080. So with that, Mr. Michaela.
Thank you, Morgan. Good afternoon, Chair Morgan, Member Johnson, Member Katsaros, Mr. Secretary. For the record, I am John McKellar with the Attorney General's Office. Before you today is Regulation 22.080 as amended by the Commission on August 27th. The amendments were adopted to allow books to take action on the Kentucky Derby and some other races for which the tracks were not going to let the books participate in the parimutuel pools operated by the tracks. The amendments to Regulation 22.080 sunset on November 19th of this year. The amendments allow the board chair to approve requests from racebooks to determine the winners of wagers on horse races with information received from a nationally televised broadcast without using a disseminator. These amendments were requested by Mark Rubenstein on behalf of the Nevada Parimutuel Association. The board moved these changes forward in an expedited manner because a regulation petition by the Parimutuel Association and their NRS 463.145 would not have allowed adoption by the Commission in time for this year's Kentucky Derby. Comments made prior to and at the Commission adoption hearing on August 27th raised two main issues. One, that 22.080 should authorize sources beyond nationally televised broadcast to determine wager outcomes without the use of a disseminator, and 2, that the statute prohibited the adopted amendments. Both of these issues were addressed at the commission adoption hearing. In my comments at the commission hearing, I indicated broader changes, including internet streaming, should be considered by the legislature. The use and licensing of disseminators is set out in statute. There is an exception from disseminator licensing requirements for televised broadcasts. A televised broadcast is the transmission of programming by radio wave, by cable wire, or by satellite. It does not include an internet streaming service. Including any source other than televised broadcasts outside of the disseminator requirements would probably be broader than statute allows and should be brought before the legislature. At the commission's adoption hearing, it was argued that the amendments violate statute because although there is an exception from the disseminator licensing requirements for a broadcaster to provide information from an out-of-state source through a televised broadcast, this exception does not extend to a racebook receiving the information from the broadcaster without the racebook having its own disseminator license. This is not the case. If it was, a racebook could not receive any information without a disseminator's license. That is, a racebook could not receive information from a broadcaster or the disseminator which has an agreement with the track without the racebook having its own disseminator's license. This is an absurd result. NRS 463.430 requires a disseminator's license to bring information from an out-of-state source into Nevada. Once the disseminator brings the information into Nevada, a racebook may use the information for its operation. By the same token, a broadcaster brings information from an out-of-state source into Nevada through its broadcast. Once this information is brought into Nevada, a book does not need a disseminator's license to receive the information. The broadcaster does not need a disseminator's license to bring the information into Nevada because it has a specific exemption from licensing in NRS 463.430 subsection 2A. To interpret these provisions any other way would render the broadcaster exception meaningless, and it is a strong tenet of statutory construction that all provisions have meaning. Additionally, NRS 463.440 subsection 1 makes it a matter of public policy that racebooks are entitled to receive on a fair and equitable basis all information concerning racing being disseminated into Nevada. While a broadcaster has an exception from being licensed as a disseminator, it is still disseminating information into Nevada, and the racebooks have a right to use that information. Finally, prior to the changes, the very subsection of the regulation which the Commission amended prohibited a book's use of race information unless it was obtained from a licensed disseminator. If statute absolutely prohibited receiving information from a televised broadcast, this subsection would not have been necessary. The Parimutuel Association desired the changes because Nevada books were not going to be allowed to participate in the Kentucky Derby Parimutuel Pool this year. The adopted changes allowed books to book bets on the Kentucky Derby and a few other races with board chair approval until the sunset of the adopted changes on November 19th. It is my understanding that the next major race meets where Nevada books might not be allowed to participate in the track parimutuel pools do not take place until next spring. Because of this, no action is required of the board today. There is plenty of time for the submission and consideration of an NRS 463.145 petition, or if the industry desires to use information sources other than televised broadcast to determine the outcomes of horse wagers without using a disseminator, there is time for the industry to seek a change to the disseminator requirements during the next session of the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview, Mr. Michaela. So just so just for some background a little bit as well, so I'm clear, I know that this, as you mentioned, this kind of request from the Parimutuel Association did come based on some issues, contract issues that they had with Churchill Downs. But as you just mentioned, there are no races that would actually take place until the spring of next year. where this regulation is currently drafted today would actually be triggered because of an issue with the downs. Is that correct?
It's my understanding that all the books have agreements with the tracks to participate in their parimutuel pools until next spring with the Churchill Downs races, where there's not currently an agreement to participate in that track. So based on the stated reason the NPMA gave the board, this regulation would not be necessary again until then.
Thank you, Mr. Michaela. All right, I know that we do have, I see Member Johnson, and I'm just, do you have any questions for Mr. Michaela? Or if not, I assume you will chime in. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move on. I think the first person that I'd like to call forward to see if they have any comments is Mr. Mark Rubenstein.
Thank you, Chairwoman Morgan, Member Johnson. I would like to, first of all, thank the board and the commission for processing the regulation on such short notice. As you recognize, we found ourselves in a contractual pickle with Churchill Downs. Generally, we're pleased with our ability to book races from Churchill Downs for the Derby, or book a race for the Derby and for the Kentucky Oaks. What the industry, I think, would like to see, first of all, is obviously the removal of the sunset, assuming that we can come to some sort of industry consensus. Second, while we understand the Deputy Attorney General's position with respect to the online results, we think it would be helpful to clarify that we can at least or should verify the results, or have the ability to verify the results from a credible online news service. And I don't know that that's necessary in the regulation. Maybe that's something that can be done through the internal controls system, since we would only be actually paying off of the televised broadcast. I think that the main changes I think we would like to see is to be able to book all of the races on that particular race day, and not just the named events from that track for that date. Because that's traditionally what we would do, and that's traditionally what's being held up by the lack of a contract. So I think that's the other issue that we didn't get into, and I don't know if it's going to be raised again in the workshop, is the issue of a delay via television signal. And so our suggestion is that if that remains a concern, that we clarify that the wagers be locked out when the first horse enters the gate, as opposed to 2 minutes to post time or post time. We think that's more than adequate time and gives the bettors a little more time to place their wagers just prior to the race. So right now, those are the extent of our comments. I'd like to reserve the ability to respond to other comments as they might come in. Oh, by the way, I should introduce Patty Jones is here, the executive director of the Parimutuel Association, and she's here to also help answer any questions. One other thing I would like to point out with respect to what DAG Michaela said with respect to the rest of the year, we believe that's true. Officially, we have not signed a deal yet for Breeders' Cup, so that contract is still officially pending.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. And welcome, Ms. Jones. Did you have any additional comments, or?
No, I think he's covered everything. We discussed it before he got on the Zoom.
All right. All right, thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. Moving on, Mr. Lieberman. I wanted to give you an opportunity to offer any public comments on this regulation, if you so desire.
Thank you, Chairwoman Morgan. Member Katsaros, and Member Johnson. My name is Barry Lieberman, and I am appearing at this workshop on behalf of the South Point Hotel and Casino to comment on the recently enacted Regulation 22.080. We submitted a letter in connection with the Nevada Gaming Commission meeting on August 25th. So that was our position. One of the things I'd like to do here is discuss the history of wagering in Nevada through my eyes, because I think that's really helpful for everybody to see how the dissemination requirement came about along with the changes over the years. And so I've sort of put together a little broad overview on that. So I've been a horse racing fan all my life and used to go to racetracks in New York as soon as I was able to in 1970. This was, of course, the only way to actually watch most horse racing, since only the big races, such as the Kentucky Derby, were nationally televised. I first came to Nevada in 1977 when I was a young attorney with the tax division of the United States Department of Justice. The sports and race books were mostly standalone places outside of the hotel casinos. I used to go to Leroy's and the Del Mar Race and Sports Book, both of which were located in downtown Las Vegas. Betting was done on handwritten tickets, and a, quote, magical voice, unquote, from the ceiling speaker would provide a recreation of the races as if someone was actually watching the race. In reality, they were simply looking at a chart of the race and recreating it from the chart. There was no parimutuel wagering or racing at that time in Nevada. The books simply booked the bet and paid off track prices subject to maximum payout limits listed in the books. The statutes and regulations requiring Nevada licensed disseminators to provide race results before payoffs could be made were enacted for this type of system and were generally governed by Regulation 22, which covered both race and sports books. I moved to Nevada in 1983 to become an assistant United States attorney. The sea change in parimutuel wagering occurred in 1983. In a blockbuster move in March of 1983, Caesars Palace entered into an exclusive agreement with the New York Racing Association to televise races from New York, thoroughbred tracks operated by the New York Racing Association, Aqueduct, Belmont, and Saratoga, into the Caesars Palace Racebook. Caesars also had the right to subcontract the simulcast to other betting outlets in Nevada. An article in the New York Times heralded the momentous event when Caesars simulcast the races from Aqueduct Racetrack. The article appeared in the March 6, 1983 edition of the New York Times. So then the races, of course, were still booked by Caesars Palace when they had the simulcast. In May 1983, the Nevada legislature made extensive amendments to NRS 464 pursuant to AB 535, which had the effect of legalizing off-track parimutuel wagering and racing wagering and delegating to the Nevada Gaming Commission the duty to draft appropriate regulations to effectuate the changes in NRS 464. However, the reality of off-track parimutuel wagering did not come to fruition until 1991. Between 1983 and 1987, licensed disseminators negotiated for rights with racetracks to bring simulcast signals into Nevada, which the racetracks could purchase from the disseminator at prices unilaterally set by the disseminator, with no required review of the cost of the disseminator to acquire the simulcast signal. There were 3 disseminator companies that controlled the market and entered into agreements with racetracks around the country. The 3 disseminator companies were controlled by Tommy Roberts, who was Todd Roberts' dad, Chuck DeRocco, and Richard Scott. The racebooks continued to book wagers even on those tracks where patrons could watch the race, and the system proved to be somewhat chaotic in terms of pricing for the simulcasts offered to the racebooks by the 3 disseminators. In 1987, the Nevada legislature amended NRS 463 to create a system for, quote, live broadcasts, unquote, which permitted disseminators to submit a proposal for the exclusive right to disseminate a live broadcast for a racing meet to the Gaming Control Board in accordance with regulations to be adopted by the Commission. If the Gaming Control Board approved the proposal, fees would be established by the board for the dissemination of the live broadcast, which would have to be offered to all race books at the same rate. The regulations were eventually promulgated, and the going rate to be paid by the books for the live broadcast was generally established to be 3% of the handle. In 1988, Las Vegas Dissemination Company began business and made an immediate impact not only as another disseminator to compete in the Nevada market, but as the eventual key component to allowing Nevada race books to have wagers made in Nevada placed in parimutuel pools at racetracks around the country. As explained by LVDC on its website, a key milestone of the company occurred in 1990 when Nevada's gaming industry conducted a test to implement off-track parimutuel wagering between Nevada licensed race books and various racetracks throughout the country. LVDC was selected as the systems operator to conduct the new venture. Following a successful one-year test period, LVDC entered into a long-term exclusive contract with the Nevada Parimutuel Association for off-track parimutuel wagering and remains the sole Nevada licensed provider of this service. On behalf of the South Point, and I concede we might be somewhat biased, Las Vegas Dissemination Company has provided outstanding service to the race books in Nevada for all of its 32 years of existence and has been a reliable partner for all these years. With the advent of off-track parimutuel wagering in 1991, the legislature amended NRS 464.020 to give the Nevada Gaming Commission the option to appoint a committee consisting of persons who are licensed to engage in off-track parimutuel wagering and grant the committee the exclusive right to negotiate the agreement relating to off-track parimutuel wagering with both LVDC for the systems operator contract and the racetracks in other states that conduct parimutuel wagering. Regulations were eventually enacted and all the race books in the state served on the committee. However, that proved to be unwieldy and gave disproportionate power to companies that operated multiple race books. In 1997, the legislature amended NRS 464.020 to provide for 9 representatives to serve on the committee, with the requirements for the representatives specified in the statute. In 2005, the legislature increased the number of persons on the committee to 11, which is the number of members currently on the committee. Although I don't remember the exact number of years I have served on the committee, I am pretty sure it is at least 20 years. First as a representative of the Orleans Hotel and Casino, and now as a representative of the South Point Hotel and Casino. In all those years, it has been a pleasure to interact with the other committee members, a collegial group that has worked well together to represent the interests of all race books in Nevada, both big and small. Our negotiations with tracks to receive their simulcast signal and the right to commingle the bets placed in the Nevada race books into the tracks pool have generally been cooperative, and we have always tried to have rates paid for the various tracks remain in similar ranges for tracks with similar handles, amount of handle. In other words, tracks that generated larger handles generally received a higher percentage of wagers made at our race books, while smaller tracks that generated less handle received a lower percentage of the wagers made at the race books. Some of the tracks were licensed in Nevada and could receive a percentage of the handle, but others were not licensed and could only receive a flat fee, which the committee tried to tie to anticipated handle for the track. While there have been occasional disputes with racetracks over the years with respect to the rates Nevada could pay the racetrack, most of those disputes have been resolved. This year, the committee found itself facing a track that showed no desire to negotiate and then proposed what the committee viewed as an absurd rate that was far outside the parameters of amounts paid to our other racetrack partners who were similarly situated. When an agreement could not be reached, our race books were determined to book races the way we did prior to 1991. We were also advised by LVDC that Churchill Downs' threatened to sue them if they disseminated the results of the Churchill Downs races to the race books in Nevada. LVDC asked the Nevada Parimutuel Association to indemnify them in the event that Churchill Downs carried through on their threat. That was not a viable option since there are more than 180 non-restricted racebook licenses in Nevada, and about 69 of those are parimutuel race books. The others are non-parimutuel books. An agreement of all the books could not be obtained, nor would the corporate officers of the Nevada Parimutuel Association approve the indemnification, although Mr. Rubenstein can better address that. I want to emphasize that we don't feel LVDC is to blame for the situation, and that they have been an outstanding and valuable partner to the industry since they started operations in 1988, both as a disseminator and as a systems operator that enables the Nevada racebooks to commingle bets made in Nevada into a track pool. However, we also believe there are reliable and verifiable third-party providers of race results who could provide results to LVDC to disseminate to the racebooks that are LVDC customers. And that would eliminate any threat of litigation against them from Churchill Downs, since the results of the races would have been obtained from a verifiable and legitimate source other than Churchill Downs. To the extent LVDC feels it cannot disseminate results from racetracks to the racebooks that are LVDC customers, the regulation adopted by the Nevada Gaming Commission at its August 27, 2020 meeting, with the suggested changes made in our August 25th letter, and which I will now discuss, should remain in effect permanently. From a policy standpoint, the regulation is the proper way to deal with the situation we unfortunately find ourselves in because of Churchill Downs' refusal to negotiate in good faith and in light of their threats to initiate litigation against LVDC. If LVDC provided race results from Churchill Downs to its customers, if LVDC provided race results from Churchill Downs to its customers, there would be no issue with respect to the regulation. Horse racing bets have been booked in Nevada since horse racing bets were first legalized in Nevada, or Nevada licensed race and sports books. Revenues in the form of gaming taxes are lost by the state of Nevada when the race books cannot accept bets on races and pay tax on the gross gaming revenue, regardless of whether that revenue results from parimutuel wagers or booked wagers. While the South Point and almost every other race book in the state would rather have bets placed in a parimutuel pool when a reasonable agreement can be reached with a track, we are willing to book bets for graded stakes races where there is no parimutuel agreement with the track, if permitted by the regulation. We are clearly able to book races, whether graded stakes or otherwise, if the disseminator provides us with the results of the booked races. In other words, if LVDC provides us with race results, we can book any race. As we wrote in our letter to the Nevada Gaming Commission on August 25th, our solution is to permit the results shown on a nationally broadcast grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3 stakes race to be used for payoffs on booked races where results from a disseminator are not available. We think the regulation should be amended to simply allow the use of the results of the national broadcast for payoffs for these limited types of races. That it is rare that there are these stakes races. They tend to be a lot of them on Kentucky Derby Day, on Oaks Day, on the Travers Day, on Preakness Day. And that would give us the ability to book more races on the particular day rather than a single one. And Mr. Rubenstein briefly addressed that in his comments. So the other thing is that you were put in the chairwoman is put in the unfair position of deciding which races should be allowed. And that's one of the reasons we think making it an objective test of grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3 stakes races is a good change, because it allows you just to look at what the condition of the race is and decide whether or not to authorize the book races. And if the regulation said grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3 stakes races, it would make your job a lot easier.
And it would give greater certainty to the book so that they would have some type of objective understanding as to what could potentially be approved.
Correct. So allowing the race books to book the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks during the Labor Day weekend with results obtained from the national broadcast did not create any substantial problems, and the state will receive gaming tax revenue from the gross gaming revenue earned by the books on those races. In summary, the amendment to Regulation 22.080 worked well and provides Nevada a viable alternative when a racetrack makes unreasonable demands to allow Nevada wagers to be placed into the track's parimutuel pool. So with the proposed amendment to allow for grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 stakes races, we believe that this regulation should be made permanent. And I would be happy to answer any questions you or other members may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lieberman, for not only your potential recommendations to the board and the commission regarding changes to the regulation, but also for the historical context you gave. I think that was beneficial, not only for me, but for hopefully the other board members and commissioners who will be reviewing this transcript as well. Are there any questions for Mr. Lieberman? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you could stay on, if everyone who's participating could stay on, I would appreciate it. I'm assuming there may be some additional questions as well. Just to be, I have one follow-up though, Mr. Lieberman. The grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 stakes races, are all of those televised? You've heard some comments from the Parimutuel Association, obviously, about wanting streaming, and the board through our council kind of acknowledged that the initial public notice that was sent for the initial draft that was heard before the board, would not have contemplated that. Are you willing to share any thoughts on those grade stakes races? Are they televised? And if they're not, what are your thoughts on the streaming option?
So generally the stakes races are televised. And of course, if they weren't, we would not be allowed to book them without results from a disseminator. I agree with the Attorney General that streaming is one step further than what is allowed by the current regulation and statute, and would probably require a statutory change. But I think enough of the stakes races are nationally televised on regular networks or things like NBC Sports Network that we could certainly operate well with the stakes races that are actually televised on a national broadcast.
Thank you, Mr. Lieberman. All right, if there's nothing else, then we'll move to Mr. Ferrario. Hello again.
Unmute. I think it works.
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Well, some people may not want to see me, but here I am. Okay, so I've gone back and looked at the record that's been created and looked at the initial letter that we sent, and I would simply say that I stand by the conclusions we reached there. But what we did, Chairwoman Morgan, is we went back and did a more robust, I guess, review of the legislative history that relates to this area. And I think when you look at the evolution of the disseminator statutes, the regulations, and you take it step by step, you can really reach only one conclusion here. And with all due respect to all the lawyers on this call and Deputy AG McKella, I think they've reached the wrong conclusion if they think that this regulation complies, or this amended regulation complies with the statute. It simply does not. And what you're seeing here in the comments, and again, I appreciate Mr. Lieberman's compliments towards LBDC, because they got a little tense at the last hearing. LBDC has been an integral part of this industry from its inception. My other client, Nevada Dissemination Service, the same thing. They've been there essentially from the beginning. the reason this industry clicks isn't just what's going on at the hotels and in the race books, it's what's going on behind the scenes. And what's going on behind the scenes is we have a regulatory system made up of the disseminators and my client LBDC who makes this tick. And this system works seamlessly and has worked seamlessly for a long time, as Mr. Lieberman said. I've been dealing with LBDC's issue since the early 90s. So what we have here, and I understand the frustration of the books given what happened with Churchill. I get that, okay? And again, that wasn't our fault. It's not your fault. I don't know what happened to the negotiations. I don't know why it broke down, but necessity cannot override clear statutory mandates. And that's really what's happening here. And I don't know that I've ever seen another situation in the gaming arena where that has occurred. So I will just step back and I'll give you a few comments. First, I don't think there should be any further expansion of this regulation, okay? Debating whether it's streaming or whether it's a stake race that's televised, that should not happen, okay? I think the regulation should sunset at this point in time in November, okay? And then I think if there's going to be a discussion, there should be a discussion amongst the industry proponents. Perhaps there's going to be a discussion at the legislature, but that's where this discussion belongs. If you look at the statute in question, 463-430, okay, the exemption that everybody is hanging their hat on, or the exception, says the provision does not apply to any person who provides a televised broadcast which is presented without charge to any person who receives the broadcast. That can't be any clearer. This provision does not criminalize NBC or CBS or ABC or any other network who televises their race and it's used in a race and sports book. What's missing from the analysis, and what I listened to with great interest with what Deputy AG McKellar said, there is no language in the statute that says that information can be used to operate a race and sports book. That's the problem. If the legislature wanted to create the exception that is being proffered here, they could have done that. They didn't. And in fact, they left intact all the language that we've cited in our letter that says if you're going to use information to operate a race and sports book, if you're going to use information to pay the patrons, to determine the winners and losers, which is much different than just watching it on the screen for entertainment value. But if you're going to use that information, then it has to come from a licensed source. And that is set forth in 463-441B, which no one was talking about. And it's, I'll just quote, all persons, associations, locations, practices, and activities related to the dissemination and use of information concerning horse racing should be controlled, supervised, and properly licensed. And that is the issue. And so we think, you know, what's done is done. We can't go back and change it, okay? But again, I don't take any great comfort in bringing this forward to you and to challenge Deputy AG McKellar, but I simply, and my clients simply disagree with the legal conclusion that was reached. It's unfortunate that we didn't get our comments in earlier. Maybe we could have had a more robust discussion at the commission meeting, and I apologize to you, and I apologize to the commission for the late submission of our position. But we've gone back now and really harvested all of the legislative history. You can see what happened in 1995, which had the 1985 amendment remained in place, then this regulation might arguably be permissible, the amended regulation. But the legislature came back in 1989 and took out that language that would have made this permissible and then narrowed the exception. So at this point, Chairwoman Morgan, I think we should allow this to sunset. There should not be any further creep into the disseminator arena. Again, there's valid and good reasons to to have this process. It gives the state the ability to control, if you will, the flow of information. That's important. Someone will be held accountable if there's mistakes. That's the disseminators. They are licensees. They are under your control and your guidance. And so at this point, I think we should stop the creep. And if there's going to be a debate, let it happen at the legislature. I also have, I hope on this call, I tried to set this up, so I apologize if there's a flub up. But Mr. Roberts would like to speak and address the group here.
Sure, that's fine. Before, Mr. Farrer, though, before we go to Mr. Roberts, I just wanted to confirm, I know we discussed this during the public comment section, but your September 21st, 2020 letter that was sent to our Executive Secretary, Marie Bell, will be definitely a part of this transcript, this workshop.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Morgan.
All right, Mr. Roberts, Todd Roberts.
Hi, can you see me?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman. Thanks for the opportunity to make comments. As a little background, our company was one of the first disseminator companies in Nevada. My father was licensed in 1984. Company began operations. I came to work a year after and have been involved in the process for 35 years. I've been a licensee for 32. I think I'd first like to address the technical side of my previous comments, which have to do with latency. So what we did to try to give you a more accurate picture of the issues surrounding latency and the use of national television broadcasts is during the Kentucky Derby race, we had engineers at the racetrack and we had engineers here in our corporate headquarters where our operations center is, monitoring the various feeds that are considered to be the national television broadcast, which was NBC. So the first distinction that we want to make is that a national television broadcast 30 some years ago, as written in the regulations and the statutes, is not the same national television broadcast of today. And by that I mean that those broadcasts were analog. Today's broadcasts are digital, and when you have digital broadcast, you introduce delay. So what we did was further dive into exactly how a casino may use a national television broadcast versus the authorized wagering feeds that my sister company, Roberts Communications Network, provides to almost every racetrack in the world for a variety of reasons. So to give you a comparative figure, the Roberts live video stream provided on behalf of racetracks has a delay of 4 seconds, which is a huge improvement in technology over even last year. The brick and mortar or simulcast feed, as we know it, in Nevada we call it the live broadcast, that feed has 5 seconds of delay. These are approximate, rounded off to the nearest second. The NBC off-air national television broadcast, and when I say off-air, I mean the way we used to receive it 30 years ago with rabbit ears or an antenna, had approximately 14 seconds of delay for the Kentucky Derby. But the difference in today's world is that you can receive that same NBC feed, and most of us do, not through an antenna, unless we're in a rural area, but through, in this area, cable, which is Cox, and that feed had 15 seconds of delay, or probably the most popular, Dish Network or DirecTV. Those feeds had 26 seconds of delay. And I should add that this is the delay as measured at the output of a decoder box or at the output of an off-air antenna. But what happens further in a casino environment is they redistribute the video internally to all their televisions. And each casino does something different. There's 3, 4, 5 different methods of distribution that add even further delay. So, as you can see, a national television broadcast is not what it used to be. And we think that is an extremely dangerous precedent for a bookmaker to engage in the use of. Case in point, we have two very real examples, one that hit home here recently with Korean baseball games, which they were using just the published game time. And guess what? The sports books got pass posted for a lot of money. It created a black eye for Nevada. And it's a real example of why disseminators are needed, because that game time would have been verified by a disseminator. And by the way, sports wagering is coming all over the country, and the rest of the world with sports wagering is going to go the opposite way of what we're talking about today. And by that, I mean, you're going to see sports disseminators bringing authorized wagering feeds on behalf of leagues and teams, so that the entertainment feeds that appear on national television broadcasts don't create wagering problems related to pass posting. Second example, case in point, probably 5-6 years ago, World Cup soccer in South Africa, the European bookmakers were taken for something like $3, $4, $5 million on pass posting related to penalty kicks, where they had someone in the stands at the stadium. The bookmakers were using a high definition television broadcast, which had over 45 seconds of delay approximately. And they knew the results every time they made a bet. So another real world example. In horse racing, you only have a 2-minute race generally. So 26 to 30 seconds of delay, whatever it may be, is a big, big advantage for a bettor. So imagine this, imagine someone takes a video stream that all the account wagering companies use, and they're sitting in your race books with an iPad or a phone watching the video stream that my company provides with 4 seconds of delay, standing at the betting window, knowing that they have 26 more seconds to make a bet and have an idea of what's happened already. I don't see how that protects the public interest. I don't see how the bookmakers would want to engage in that kind of wagering. And you know, you'd have to protect, it goes both ways. The bookmakers could take advantage of the public, and the public could take advantage of the bookmakers. The tracks don't want the black eye from that scandal. We don't want the black eye. The state shouldn't want it, and the bookmakers shouldn't want it. Mark Rumstein's comments about the first horse entering the gate, I think, are extremely valid. The regulations were written some 30 years ago, 25 years ago, where we talked about live broadcasts and how do we use it to determine post time. And we stated that it was when the last horse entered the gate. So obviously with a feed with 5 seconds of delay, the last horse entering the gate provided enough protection for the bookmakers. Moving it to the first horse entering the gate is still a bit of a crapshoot, because you could have horses enter and load very quickly, and they could be loaded in a 20-horse race perhaps in 10 seconds, and it could be even longer and provide great protection. But I still think it needs a little bit more thought to just say when the first horse enters the gate when you're not sure of what the latency is that someone is using. But it certainly helps. So I appreciate those comments. Lastly, I want to bring up a point that I don't think anybody thought about, and that is that TV broadcasts on a national television basis come and go. One of horse racing's biggest problems as a sport is that we have not had great coverage nationally on television. Typically, the big three races, the Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont, and the Breeders' Cup races would get national television coverage. Beyond that, bigger races, perhaps that Barry Lieberman was alluding to, grade 1, 2, 3, we've had a variety of broadcast networks try to present more races with some to moderate success. Lately, we've had a tremendous improvement nationally with the Fox broadcast that the New York Racing Association is presenting. But my comment there is you cannot rely and build an industry around that, because they could be gone tomorrow if badminton becomes more popular. The networks are going to dump horse racing and show that. Lastly, the biggest problem I see with what transpired more recently with the negotiation process is this. We have a system that has evolved over time, and Barry did a great job of giving the history to everyone. I'm going to give this in an order that is more current. Currently, the system would be that the parimutuel association would try to negotiate a parimutuel contract. That's their first choice. If that process fails and that negotiation fails, the second act that's supposed to happen is that the disseminators have the right and the ability, per their license, per history, to go in and negotiate with the racetracks and to present the live broadcast for bookmaking purposes, where the use of that live broadcast would allow them to take wagers when the last horse entered the gate. And we all now know, based on my report here today, that that latency is only 5 seconds. The third possibility is if that negotiation fails, then the books can book, we'll call it the old-fashioned way, using the wire service that LBDC provides, which, by the way, our company has the same license. We could provide results if need be. And in the past, with previous Churchill Downs disputes, we were asked to provide those results. And then we were also provided a letter by Churchill Downs which said, if you provide any results based on our information pursuant to our other relationships with your company, then we'll sue you. So that still remains the viable option, and that's the one that we're talking about today. And everyone knows, including a lot of the tracks, that if it gets to that level, that the books have their hands full because they're not used to booking, because they've been doing pari-mutuel now for so long, and they don't have video to go with the booking process. And it's up to the disseminator, LBDC, to get some kind of verifiable information to at least make payouts on. The problem with what we're proposing today is that everybody's forgetting about step 2. So in this Churchill Downs dispute, if this is another racetrack who says, I'm not going to make a deal with you for pari-mutuel, we have the right as disseminators to go in and try and get the rights for bookmaking purposes using a live broadcast, which would be not so bad. The problem is you're amending the regulation to let everybody bypass that step and rely on this new amended regulation. So how do I have a marketplace where the books are allowed by law to be a buying co-op for pari-mutuel purposes, but when that fails, I have to go negotiate with those same books who are still a buying co-op, but all of a sudden they take off their buying co-op hat and say, oh yeah, we'll give you a fair shot. What do you got to offer? That's not going to happen, especially if this regulation goes into effect, because they're going to say, we don't need your feed. We'll just go use the national television broadcast. We have as big an investment in this industry as any race book. And if you ask my father, he would say that the race book industry is what it is today because of the investment that our family made early on. So we're kind of the forgotten stepchild here in this process, but I think it would be absolutely impossible for us to have a fair shot to use the license that we have to get a return on our investments over the years if this regulation is passed, because you can't undo the power that you gave the Pari-Mutuel Association for pari-mutuel purposes and mix it with these other regulations. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Roberts, thank you very much for your comments and your willingness to appear today. I did have a couple of comments. One, I didn't want anyone to think that they were being forgotten. When we initially contemplated having this matter for the August board meeting, we were sure to reach out to see and make sure everyone had an opportunity. I know it was a very short time frame, but that's the purpose of this workshop today. And I'm just letting you, everyone participating today, I truly find this workshop to be information gathering for you and others like you to be able to kind of give some history and some background in the processes. And I don't plan on taking any action today at this workshop. This is really just to kind of get information and give people enough time to have their thoughts together so they could actually share those with myself and for the board members who wish to participate today. I know you made some comparisons and analogies to some of the past posting issues or kind of the in-play wagering. I don't know if that's, I think that's kind of apples to oranges there. I think some of those actually could have been, I don't see that being kind of a widespread issue. I think a lot of that was actually error, human error that were made there. But I understand what you're saying is that the fact that you have the disseminators and have had the disseminators in this position for such a long time, that has allowed those type of errors to not exist in the horse racing arena.
Well, they were all related to latency. And the disseminator process would have eliminated them because we would have been forced to use a broadcast feed that was built with low latency to avoid that.
Okay. I wanted to, just to confirm too for the record. So you are a licensee with Nevada Disseminator Service, correct?
Correct.
And you mentioned your other company, Roberts Communications Network.
Correct.
And can you just tell us a little bit about that company and what it does?
So Roberts Communications Network competes for contracts with racetracks to provide their simulcast feed that goes to brick and mortar outlets all over the world. We get the exclusive right to be their distributor. So they license the content and we distribute the feed built to their specs. We also provide and compete for the same process for video streams and race replays, which go to count wagering companies using the internet. We provide a variety of other services for OTBs, racetracks, reception locations. We have a data communications network over which the tote data, including Nevada's, which comes from LVDC, travels all over the world to wherever it's intended to go. We've had a 35-year history with racetracks providing these kind of services. When it comes to Nevada, we actually hand off the feed to the licensed disseminators to distribute and handle pursuant to Nevada law.
Okay. And I had another question. You mentioned that typically when the Parimutuel Association would be at a crossroads with the track at that point, if those negotiations were unsuccessful, disseminators could go in and negotiate directly with the track. And then if that failed, then books could use the disseminator's wire service. Did I get that correctly?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Is that in part of an agreement, or is that just typically the way it's been operating for the last 20, 30 years?
That's what the regulations were built to allow for. It actually worked in reverse, though. It started with the old-fashioned methods that Barry described, where it was like the movie The Sting, where you listened to recreations of broadcasts and relied on a bookmaking service, which happened to be run by the mob, and they also owned a couple race books, so the public was being defrauded. So it started with that. Live broadcast came next, which made the booking process a little bit safer and more modern. And then it went to parimutuel wagering using the same live broadcast.
And so have you participated, or are you aware of any discussions between either yourself, I guess I think we have someone from LVDC on as well, with those negotiations with Churchill Downs that you're able to share publicly?
We're in constant contact with every racetrack that comes into Nevada, plus many more. And this is part of our frustration is we feel like we could be a valuable asset to Nevada, but we're not based on the process that we have. And each and every time a broadcast comes in to Nevada, the disseminator has to make a determination as to whether or not they can do their part with the fees that are on the table. Lots of times there's not enough money for a track to even pay the disseminator any money. So two of the things that we do, we're constantly discounting disseminator fees. In fact, that business has lost money for 3 straight years. It's not even a business. But the Roberts business discounts its contracted fees over 70% so that Nevada can continue to get the signals that they negotiate for. And those discounted fees, unlike everywhere else in the world, those fees are required to be paid by the racetrack, not the casinos, whereas everywhere else in the world, those fees are paid by the receiving outlet. So this is another sticking point with a lot of the tracks. They get to the brick and mortar locations in Nevada and say, why do we have to pay for Nevada's reception of our signal when everywhere else the receiving location pays? And you can work around it by just paying more money and then they pay the bill. But the point I'm trying to make is that we make tremendous sacrifices to make this process work. And I just don't know how much longer we can or want to do that if the negotiation process continues down the path that I see it on, which is completely ineffective. If it were a business, you would have fired the Nevada Parimutuel Association, plain and simple.
All right, thank you, Mr. Roberts. I think you have a question for Member Johnson, Mr. Roberts.
I do. Mr. Roberts, thank you for your testimony today. I was curious, based on your experience and knowledge, what were the most, adverse outcomes of this temporary regulation having been in effect over the past several weeks?
Well, we've had two races. I think it was the Oaks and the Derby that it was approved for. And I don't think anybody knows at this point if anybody got pass posted. But once it becomes permanent and the betting world knows that you're relying on a feed that has basically 30 seconds of latency, look out. And there's, quite frankly, it's not illegal. I mean, you could walk up to the counter with a video stream on your phone and know that you have a 30-second advantage over the bookmaker and make your bet. And it's at that point that you would see adverse effects.
All right. And also, given your knowledge and experience of the industry, how self-correcting will the marketplace be, so to speak, with regards to patrons either attempting to defraud the operators or operators defrauding the patrons as a result of any latency issues? Will people vote with their feet, so to speak, one way or the other?
Well, first of all, I don't think our licensees would ever try to defraud the betting public, but one thing that it limits is their ability to do in-race wagering, because with that kind of delay, you just can't, you would actually have an unbelievable advantage over the bettor, and it wouldn't be fair. In reverse, the wagering public is what it is, and I think bookmakers speak to it better than anyone. Anybody on the betting side that can get an edge is going to try and use it, and to ignore it, we're all putting our heads in the sand. It's going to happen. People will try to get an advantage, and then, quite frankly, in harness racing, which is where they pull the driver in a cart behind the horse, in our Roberts business, we actually provide specially built feeds that have even less latency, because those kind of bettors bet off of what they call the break. It's a rolling start, and they literally are looking for a 1 or 2 second advantage to see how a horse breaks before they place their bets in rapid fire succession. So depending on the bettor, the latency has even more effect. Thoroughbred racing, not as much as harness, but it's going to have an effect.
Okay. And then I think lastly for you, did I sense perhaps some at least degree of receptiveness to entertaining discussions about a lockout period, for example, to address the latency? I think it was Mr. Lieberman who may have proffered that concept, but what am I to understand to be your general position regarding that?
So yes, from a pure technical argument standpoint, I would say that Mark's suggestion is moving closer to the proper way to handle the latency issue. I would rather see it treated more like the stock market treats the close of trading. They say at 4 o'clock Eastern time, all trades cease. And in racing, it's hard to do that because post time's a moving target. The track will publish it in the morning. It'll move throughout the day based on the delays in just the normal wagering process of each race. So I would prefer to see, instead of using when the first horse enters the gate, maybe something even a little bit safer, where perhaps we say, 10 minutes or 5 minutes before the stated post time by the track. And the public will know, and they'll just have to get to the window quicker. From a business standpoint, that doesn't solve my other issue about the fact that the marketplace, you basically put me out of business in being able to sell live broadcast as a disseminator because they have this ability to bypass. Now, some books would say, hey, you know what, I'll pay for the live broadcast because I don't want to lock out 5 minutes before or when the first horse enters the gate. That's to be seen.
All right. And then lastly, either you or perhaps Mr. Ferrara, given some of the concerns I've heard about the legality of the regulation, is there a legislative remedy being contemplated or pursued? I was curious if so, and whether one option might be for the Gaming Commission to extend this regulation for some additional temporary period of 6 months, 12 months, what have you, to see any additional negative effects, but as well to see if there is a legislative remedy that might be forthcoming. Can anyone speak on that, Mr. Roberts or Mr. Ferrara?
I don't know of any, but I'll let Mark.
Member Johnson, at this point, we don't anticipate any regulatory action, quite frankly. We don't think that there should be a change to the system. And you asked an interesting question. Is the public going to vote with their feet, so to speak? I think the way the system has been implemented is you don't want the public voting with their feet because they've got problems with past posting or the accuracy of payouts or things like that. This system was designed to provide the public with a reliable means to bet on horse racing that has integrity, that is backed by a license, that is backed by this body and by the commission. And what this regulation is doing is eroding that protection. Now, we think the system has worked well. We think it should remain in effect. I suspect, given some of the comments that have been made, that there will be an effort by the industry to address some of this at the legislature. And if that's the case, then we'll address it there. I think we've made it clear in our presentation and in the paper that we submitted that the statutes, I should say, that govern this do not permit the use of this information coming from an NBC to be used to operate the book. That's the problem. And so rather than extend what I think is already an inappropriate regulation, I think it should be allowed to sunset in November. And if there are going to be broad scope changes, then that should take place at the legislature. It shouldn't take place piecemeal like we're doing now. And again, I understand the industry wanting to offer the Derby. I understand the quick nature this came, and I understand the pressure everybody was under. But we have a chance now to take a deep breath and look at this in more detail. And when you do that, and I also want to address, Mr. McKellar said, well, there would be no purpose for the exception if our position is adopted. I couldn't disagree with that more. It's clear that when the exception that's at issue now was adopted, it was to decriminalize NBC from submitting or providing information into the state. So you can read the statute harmoniously if you adopt our position, and that's what should be done. Now, you've heard a lot about the industry. I was involved in some meetings a few years ago with your predecessors when the contract was coming up for review. And it was striking to me when we met that, they had a lot of questions about what LBDC did and what the industry was about. And what was interesting is the reason they had so many questions is we're never in front of you. The system works. It works very well. You don't see patron complaints. You don't hear complaints from the book saying we're not giving them accurate information. You don't hear complaints because the system that was put in place was smart when it was put in place, and it should remain in place uneroded because it works. It works for everybody. Most particularly, it works for the state of Nevada.
All right, thank you. I didn't have any other further questions. Thank you.
Right. Next on, I think, the list of people who asked to appear, Mr. Greg Wright. And Mr. Ferrari, you represent Mr. Wright as well, correct?
I do, Chairwoman Morgan.
So please feel free to stay on then. It's on.
Chair Morgan, I don't see him listed as an attendee unless he's with someone else.
Greg Wright? No?
If Chairwoman Morgan, if he didn't pop on, then
Okay.
he's probably not going to say anything. So we can move on. I'm sorry
Okay.
for that confusion.
No worries, but his comments, you believe, would be obviously commensurate with your letter from September 21st and likely with Mr. Roberts' comments as well.
Yes.
Okay. And I think the next person on the list we have is Mr. Shearer.
Thank you, Chair Morgan.
Good afternoon.
I can adjust my camera here a little bit. Thank you. For the record, Scott Shearer on behalf of William Hill. We just agree with the comments of Mr. Rubenstein and the comments of Mr. McKellar. And I would note additionally, in addition to the comments Mr. McKellar made, that chapter or 463, 430, as he points out, says it's unlawful to do those things without having a disseminator's license. So it's really focused on who needs a disseminator's license. So to read it as saying that the book can't receive a national broadcast would be contrary to the whole purpose of this particular statute. Additionally, it also says for which the user is licensed pursuant to Chapter 464 of NRS. And so even if you say that 463, 431 applies, it applies to parimutuel wagering, not to races that are being booked. And so while we don't think it applies in the first place for the reasons Mr. McKellar said, we also think there are additional reasons why it would not make any sense to include it here. Finally, just on the history, we would also agree with Mr. Lieberman's comments. I think I mentioned at the commission hearing that I was in the Attorney General's office at the time that a lot of these statutes were being considered. I did the research on the antitrust exemption that allowed the off-track parimutuel committee to exist, and that was put into the legislation then for the 1991 legislative session. And so I agree with Mr. Lieberman and his characterization of the history, and believe for all those reasons that this regulation ought to be presented back to the commission in due course and extended, at least as Mr. Johnson says, to allow time if they want to take go to the legislature and try to clarify or change the statute. I think we ought to at least be given, or this regulation ought to be extended at least for that period of time. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Shearer. Mr. Rubenstein, you mentioned, Mr. Member Johnson, do you have any questions for Mr. Shearer? No, all right. Mr. Rubenstein, you mentioned you wanted an opportunity to speak again.
Yeah, I'd like to just address a couple things. One thing, I think we've gone so far afield here on some of the minutiae. I just want to get back to the nature of just how exceptional this exception really is. I mean, we really are talking about and probably should codify the fact that we're talking about a situation only where there is not an off-track parimutuel wagering contract in place between the race books and the track. It's in the race book's best interest for all tracks to enter into a parimutuel, an off-track parimutuel wagering arrangement. That takes the risk away from the race book. They simply take a percentage out of the handle, and they are not actually booking the wagers against the customers. I don't think anyone in their right mind wants to go back to a situation where they are booking races day in and day out. So we're talking about a very, very unusual situation, unfortunate situation, a once in 11 years that I'm aware of, and hopefully, no more than once a year if things persist with Churchill Downs. So that's one point I want to make. Number two, with respect to the latency issues, two comments. Number one, books don't allow you to bring a device to the counter to wager. So the idea of someone monitoring a stream that's not delayed and betting against a televised broadcast that may be delayed up to 30 seconds shouldn't happen. If books are doing their jobs, which I'm not aware they have not been. I don't know if any books recently have been cited for allowing people to bring electronic devices to the counter. But my guess is that there have not been any citations as of late. And then lastly, with respect to latency, The regulation does cover right now a situation where under the definition of post time in regulation 22.0 subsection 21, where there is no live broadcast or off-track parimutuel contract, post time is defined in subsection D as not later than 2 minutes before the scheduled post time is announced by the disseminator. Now, I know it's a little bit circular because in this case, we don't have a disseminator, which is why maybe we want to take a look at tweaking that regulation to perhaps address this eventuality where, and I'm not suggesting 2 minutes is the right time. We still think that the time of the first horse entering the gate is adequate enough to cover any latency issues with respect to potential past posting. To the extent someone, a race may go off a few seconds after somebody is able to, or get a wager in a few seconds after horses may have left the gate, I don't think is material or particularly concerning. So those are our comments.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. Based on that, I just wanted to give either Mr. Ferrario or Mr. Roberts or Mr. Lieberman an opportunity to have additional comments, if interested.
I don't have anything further. I think we've covered the area. I do actually have, it was funny when Mark was saying, popped into my head when he was saying, well, we have a regulation that covers it, and he said, but it covers it if you're a disseminator. So you can see how we're kind of chopping up the system, and that just is further evidence that I don't think we should be tampering with that. But with that, I think we've covered this, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Ferrario. Mr. Lieberman.
I just wanted to comment on the post time issue. I watch a lot of racing, and when you start loading the gate, the first horse, it always takes more than 26 seconds to load that gate. So I think the latency issue is taken care of if you stop it after the first horse is loading into the gate.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Roberts?
I couldn't disagree with Barry more. This is what I do for a living. And, to his point, wanting to do grade 1, 2, 3 races, they have an 8-horse field. They can load that field in 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds if things go perfect. A 20-horse Derby field might take longer to load, but that doesn't mean you write a regulation that's not careful with how we treat that. I think the solution is somewhere in how you treat post time. Let's leave it at that for now.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Okay. Member Johnson, did you have any closing comments?
I did not. Thank you.
All right. Well, for everyone who participated today, I just wanted to triple check and make sure there's no one that was missed. I think I covered everyone on our list. I'm going to assume I have Erica Okerberg, but I know that she's with Mr. Ferrario's firm as well, Greenberg Trareg. So I'm assuming there's no other comments there. I stated earlier on in the workshop that I didn't plan on formally requesting any action be taken today. This was a workshop in my point of view, it was to gather additional information. And I think we've done a good job kind of getting some history and getting different people's viewpoints out here publicly to have a good transcript with some attachments and exhibits. And I encourage you all to continue to submit anything that you think would be beneficial to the board and the commission. Obviously, this transcript will be transcribed and be forwarded to the commission if they choose to take any additional action on that sunset provision. I did want to add, though, with a lot of the comments that were being given today, albeit from people on different sides, there was a sense that this has been a well-operated system, and it's been operating very well for 20 to 30 odd years. So I obviously would encourage all of you to continue to work together. I know things have clearly broken apart a little bit over the last couple of months, but in my opinion, it's always best if you are all able to continue to work it out and talk to each other and communicate with each other. If it means going to the legislature, that obviously will take some time and you'll have some additional input for some policymakers, but I would encourage you to do that. And I'm sure the commission would echo, or at least the commission chairman would echo my comments as well. So at this point, I will be closing this part of the workshop. And seeing if there's any other public comment, Mr. Ferrato.
There's been no more public comment.
All right, thank you. This workshop is adjourned. Thank you.